I'm ready to tackle those questions you have about PDPM and figure out what's true, what's not. Let's dig in.
Welcome to the Seniors Flourish podcast, where it's all about helping occupational therapy practitioners disrupt the norm by throwing away the rainbow arc and being the best you can be when working with older adults.
Okay, guys, before we get going, before I dive into the interview, I just really want you to grab a piece of paper and a pen because my guest, Sabrena McCarley, is like dropping knowledge bombs all over the place. She's really answering your questions that you have about PDPM, kind of like saying what are the things that are myths and rumors and what are the things that are true. How can we be advocates for ourselves as clinicians? How can we be advocates for our clients? So there's just so much good information out there in this episode. And while I was recording it, I kept thinking like, oh, I should have told the listeners about this resource that I have and this resource, and the Learning Lab members have this resource. So I'm just gonna throw out some things that if you're looking for more information on like documentation, I did an entire documentation podcast at seniorsflourish.com/live about SOAP notes. I'm currently working on an ebook about how to use objective measures to make and create amazing goals, and then tips and tricks for goal writing, because that is huge in PDPM and showing one, our distinct value, two, making sure that we are documenting what we are seeing and painting that picture for our client. And then also, like if you are a Learning Lab member, we have videos in the lab currently about group and concurrent therapy, as well as how to document for each individual patient when you're working with them in a group. So go into the Learning Lab and look under group in the Learning Lab videos and resources, and you will have some really great examples and information on how to get started there. So let's dive into this episode. These are the questions that you guys have been asking. I first, I guess, want to say, like, part of this is just my goals was to have your voices heard, the questions answered. I couldn't get too specific. I only have an hour, but I really wanted to dispel some of that information, wrong information, and like look at what can we do to provide the best care for our clients. So I'm not an investigative reporter, even though I know some people really wanted me to be. I'm all about sharing the knowledge and getting some great information from Sabrina. So check it out. Welcome everyone to the Seniors Flourish podcast. My name is Mandy Chamberlain. I'm an occupational therapy, and I like to talk about everything having to do with occupational therapy, professional issues, questions, topics. And so I am very, very honored, and I really appreciate Sabrena McCarley talking with us today. She's an occupational therapist and the director of quality for RehabCare, and we are going to tackle and answer some questions and clear some rumors and talk about PDPM. So thank you so much, Sabrina, for being here today.
Of course. Thank you for having me.
Yay, PDPM.
Hey, I like PDPM. I think there's a lot of positives to PDPM, so we'll cover that.
Definitely. So let's just jump right in because it's a big topic and we're trying to condense the material. But let's just talk about your kind of just basic OT journey, how you got into OT and kind of what you're doing today. And then we'll kind of jump into what does PDPM actually stand for?
Okay, sounds good. So I've always wanted to be in some form of healthcare. I just wasn't quite sure where the path would take me with my career. And I actually learned about occupational therapy one summer when I was actually doing kind of like a summer internship for a local acute care hospital for their physical therapy department. And they said, well, do you want to go spend some time with the occupational therapist? And people who know me know that I always say yes. And so I said, sure. And that happened to be one of the best yeses that I could say. The occupational therapist just kept talking about how much they love their job. They were having so much fun. And I was like, I'm not quite sure everything you do, but I want to be you. So that kind of started my journey just by saying yes. And I feel I've been very blessed throughout my career. I've held a multitude of different positions over the years. I've done everything from being a staff therapist, really focusing predominantly on post-acute care. I've been a multi-site manager, regional directors for both operations and clinical. So really understanding that. I currently am the director of quality with RehabCare, where I provide clinical and regulatory support and clinical programming, and have really been able to help in the teaching and training and education of our therapists as well as our program directors, really with this transition to PDPM. So it's been really great within that. So that's kind of what I'm doing at the moment.
At the moment. Wow. I know I do love to hear people's journeys and how they kind of find OT. Those are like important stories to hear that everybody can kind of relate to.
Of course.
So, okay, let's just start with this. Let's just dig right in. So what does PDPM stand for? So I'm just kind of prefacing this. Like I'm try to be really good about throwing out acronyms, trying not to throw out we can do PDPM, but like if there's something that, you know what I mean? Like if there's acronyms in there, making sure that we're throwing them out there. So, okay. So what does PDPM stand for?
Well, PDPM has become the new P word. It was productivities and now it's PDPM is the phrase or the abbreviation or the acronym that we are all talking about lately.
Yeah.
And really what it is it's patient-driven payment model. And what is important about that is the first word. So the first word is patient. So PDPM really changes the focus of reimbursement and putting the focus back on the patient and the patient characteristics. And that's important for everybody to really understand because there's a reason behind the change that we had occur October 1st. The previous system, what we had within our SNFs, and it's important to note that it's for Medicare Part A only. And I know there's been some, I think you said myths out there. So there's been some confusion, some myths out there that I want to also help kind of clarify. So PDPM is for our SNFs Medicare Part A reimbursement. And what it is doing is it's shifting the Part A reimbursement from volume-based care to value-based care. And this is something that has been in the works for several years now. This isn't something that just occurred. There were many versions of this along the way, and they've settled on PDPM. And so what's important to note, though, is several items behind that. And the big one is that shift from the volume-based care to the value-based care, but also understanding kind of some of the whys behind it. When CMS was looking at this, it's really meant within to improve that payment accuracy, the appropriateness, really by focusing on the patient. And that's key because under the PPS system that we had until September 30th, really what was happening is it was volume driven. So it really was predominantly therapy rug driven. So that was our U's, our RVs, our RMs, our RHs. And we only focused on the volume piece and it was not individualized to the patient's needs. So if a patient required an extensive amount of nursing services, for example, there was no kind of compensation additionally for that. So the facilities were simply being reimbursed based upon the rug level, either nursing or therapy. And so when you're looking at those components, really therapy was the predominant factor. So therapy would treat a patient, a couple hours a day, 5, 6, maybe 7 times a week, and then nursing cared for them the rest of the time. So PDPM, what's important about it is that it consists of 5 Casemix adjustment factors. And these are all based on data-driven, stakeholder-vetted patient characteristics. And what's important to note with this is it includes physical therapy, occupational therapy, speech language pathology, the non-therapy ancillary, which is being called the NTA, if you're hearing that, as well as nursing. And one of the confusing parts to this is that every single patient that meets the criteria for a Medicare Part A stay within the skilled nursing facility, they kind of roll in the door, so to speak, with a unadjusted per diem rate where they're going to get reimbursed in each one of these categories, regardless if the patient is receiving PTOT and ST or not.
Right. Okay.
And so that's a confusing part, but the other part with that is it's nice because it's basically saying we're not incentivizing for nursing as they come in or for therapy, that this really does then adjust that unadjusted per diem rate based upon the patient characteristics. So that rate can go up, that rate can go down, but it's really meant to be specific and individualized to that patient.
Okay. So could you give an example, like to compare?
An example for the reimbursement?
Yeah.
Okay. So the way that it was as of September 30th is a patient would come in with therapy orders, say PT and OT therapy orders, and the physical therapist would evaluate, the occupational therapist would evaluate together. They would come up with kind of that clinical decision as to what is the frequency, the duration, how many therapy minutes, and what RUG category that would then fit into. Right. And so then the minutes would be planned out based upon those clinical needs to the RUG category. Under today's PDPM, what's going to happen is that comprehensive evaluation is still 1000% imperative. And it's actually, in my opinion, it's more important today than it was previously, because our evaluation is what is going to paint that picture. It's going to tell that story. You're going to gather all of those comorbidities, the past medical history, and you're really going to look at what are the true goals that are needed for this patient? What is it that brings my distinct value? And then what you're going to do based upon the goals, based upon your comprehensive evaluation, then you're making that clinical decision of saying, I know that Mr. Smith needs to go back to his assisted living. And I feel that Mr. Smith needs to be seen 5 times a week for 3 weeks. And I think that it's going to average 62 minutes of treatment. And so now that's how you're approaching the conversation more versus the RUG category.
Mm-hmm. And so does your evaluation, because PDPM is strictly for skilled nursing, right?
Correct.
Part A. So is that payment determined prior to them? Let's say they're in acute care or something like that, and then they're going to be transitioning to, skilled nursing. How does that all play together?
That's a really good question. So in the acute care hospital, the determination is made, is this patient safe to discharge back to their previous living environment? Or does this patient require skilled nursing care? And once they're made that determination that they require the skilled nursing care, then they get, transition discharged to a specific skilled nursing facility. The information that's imperative from the acute care hospital really is, what is that past medical history? What happened to them that sent them to the hospital? Looking at any surgeries, looking at those complexities with that patient, those comorbidities, and that information being able to be passed along via the medical record to the skilled nursing facility. But what happens is that information, there's no predetermination, so to speak, that says because somebody has had a left hip fracture, this patient requires 1 week of therapy services, for example. That determination isn't made in the acute care hospital.
Okay. So it's basically determined once they arrive at the skilled nursing facility, and then evaluations are completed. And then that's the determinant for payment based upon the patient's individualized needs of care. Does that sound about right?
Yes, and just to add a little bit more information to that. So what's very critical when we're talking about PDPM and the different case mix components is, so for physical therapy and occupational therapy, there's only two components to our determination for our set per diem rate. And that's the primary reason for SNF care and then the functional status. So that's why that ICD-10 coding is so imperative now, more so than it ever has been. So what is that primary reason? That also is important when you look at the speech component, because speech also, they've got more, and I know this also has caused some confusion, but for the speech component, it also is that primary reason for SNF care, their cognitive status, the presence of a swallowing disorder or mechanically altered diet, and then their other speech-related comorbidities. And then for nursing also comes into play with what is going on with them. Why are they in the SNF? Because that's the clinical information from the SNF stay. And then they also look at the functional status, extensive services, presence of depression, and then restorative nursing. So that diagnosis coding and getting as much information from the acute care hospital, that's really important. And it's important because that's really what's telling us, why is this patient needing to come to our facility, either for nursing or for PT and OT and speech.
Okay. Yeah, that kind of helps clear, because people always kind of are wondering that, like, does this make a difference? Does it not? Does it, you know what I mean? And I think when people, like we've talked about, is like, when people have a good understanding of how the whole system works, it just kind of puts people more at ease, so they have a bit of, you need to be informed. So,
and I think that one of the other really great factors that come into play now that there's such a focus on the accuracy of the diagnosis coding is that it's something that, I can say myself as an OT, we've struggled with for a very long time. What is the appropriate medical diagnosis? What's the appropriate treatment diagnosis? And so I know that one of the things that's causing some frustration out there is because we've got all these ICD-10 codes, they have to be mapped into what is being called the PDPM clinical categories. And so when the facility, for example, maybe their MDS coordinator, admissions coordinator, whoever it is in your facility that is really determining what is that medical diagnosis, when they put it into the system, there's a variety of codes that actually do not map into what is called those PDPM clinical categories. And they're coming out as this new scary kind of code that's a return to provider. And so one of the myths that I want to demythify is that the return to provider codes, they can still be utilized as a secondary medical diagnosis, and they can still be utilized as therapy treatment diagnosis. They just simply are not able to be mapped into one of the clinical categories for reimbursement.
Interesting. Gosh, there's so much in this stuff.
There's a lot.
There is a lot. So when somebody, you have their per diem rate based upon all that background information, right? Someone's being seen and they are on OT caseload. So there is, instead of me asking as a leading question, so how and who determines like the minutes and the frequency that the disciplines are supposed to be seeing a patient?
So that's a good question. The way that it should be done is really, again, I can't emphasize enough. I know I'm going to sound like a broken record, but it comes back to your evaluation because your evaluation is what needs to substantiate when whoever it is that is going to the decision maker. And it's not necessarily a decision maker. It's coming to, maybe it's your rehab director who's communicating with the facility. Maybe it's, the admissions coordinator, the administrator, that the information to say, we did our OT evaluation, we did our PT evaluation. The they're anticipating it be a 3-week length of stay or a 4-week length of stay, and they'd like to see the patient 6 times a week. And these are the goals that they're going to address. And they're anticipating it be about, on average, a 60-minute treatment. And so you have to have that clinical conversation. So it really is us as the licensed therapists that are starting the facilitation and the advocacy for that patient. Because if I do an evaluation and I go to my rehab director and I say, I want to have Mrs. Smith on my caseload 6 times a week for 4 weeks, and I want a 75-minute treatment, and I have 2 goals, that's going to be hard to substantiate. Right. So you really want to make sure that that evaluation is comprehensive. I mean, you don't want to go to the other extreme, though, and have too many goals where you know it's not realistic to be addressing them on a weekly basis. So it really is having a very comprehensive, for us as occupational therapists, really bringing that occupational profile into it and really understanding the different, low, moderate, and high complexity evaluations as well, and painting that picture. And that's the best way that we can be an advocate for the services for our patients, and by being that advocate to say, this is why I need this amount of minutes.
Yeah. And I'm a huge proponent of saying, having comprehensive evaluations, and it sounds really obvious, but it doesn't always happen. And it's like, it may be more work on the front end. And if anybody's listening to the podcast, they're probably like, oh my gosh, Mandy's going on about this again. But I really believe it. It may be more work on the front end. Maybe you're doing more objective measures than you usually do, or maybe those types of things. But then it makes goal writing easier. It makes justification for more services easier and things like that. So what would you say about those people that really feel like they're still being dictated by minutes, saying you have to see this patient this many times, this many minutes. When, we as clinicians want that, we're clinicians. We want to be able to make that clinical determination. Or they're requiring, X amount of groups a week, or X amount of concurrent, or X amount, all these kind of things where people feel like a loss of empowerment, and they feel maybe like their clinical judgment's not being met. Do you have any advice for that?
So you kind of threw about 6 questions into one.
I know. My brain is going 100 miles an hour. Okay, just take one.
No.
There.
Let me start with, because I think it's a great question. But what I want to start with, because I know that one of the biggest areas of confusion right now is on really that definition of group therapy. And
that's a good place.
And how do we make a determination if a patient is appropriate for individual versus concurrent versus group. So if I start there, I think I can tie in your other pieces.
Good one.
And so the biggest piece of advice that I have for any practitioner who is working in post-acute care, who's working in a SNF right now, is really to understand what the true regulations are. And I really feel that it is our responsibility to understand what are the rules and regulations, because it's our license and we should know the why behind an ask. And I feel very strongly about that. And so CMS has put out a great resource page for PDPM where everybody has access to it. And in there, though, what I always like to do is when I'm doing trainings, I like to provide the source document. So if somebody goes to, it's the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services final rule, and it's going to be the fiscal year 2020 Medicare payment rates and quality programs for skilled nursing. I know that's a lot, but it was released on July 30th, and it's on page 74. And why that's important is because it gives the exact information that I think that everybody needs to know in order to understand how do we start even thinking about this. So what it states in there is that effective October 1st of 2019, under the SNF PPS, group therapy will be defined as qualified rehab therapist or therapy assistant treating 2 to 6 patients at the same time who are performing the same or similar activities. So what's important about that is the definition has changed. And the definition now has gone from 4 to the 2 to 6. So there might be facilities that under the old rules and regulations, they didn't have the opportunity to provide group therapy. And now they have the opportunity if it's clinically appropriate. So I wanted to make sure that everyone understands that. The other part that's important is I know that there's some kind of misunderstandings perhaps around how much group and concurrent can actually be done per patient. So under PDPM, CMS, what they're doing is they're using a combined limit of both concurrent and group therapy to be no more than 25% of the therapy that's received by that patient for each therapy discipline per stay. So that's important. It's important because there is a cap of 25% per patient, per discipline, per stay.
Per stay. Yeah. So that's not a week. Nope. We're talking about the entire time that they're there.
And that's important because I know that there's been some confusion over, is it just concurrent or is it just group? So I wanted to clarify that. I also wanted to clarify, and I promise I'll get into your other parts, but I also wanted to clarify that the facilities are still going to have to submit. So they're going to have to provide to CMS when they submit their 5-day MDS and their discharge MDSs. What they're going to have to do is they're still going to have to provide Section O, and Section O pertains to the therapy minutes. So they're still going to be reporting to CMS how many therapy minutes per discipline and the modes of therapy. So I want to make sure everyone understands that that's information still has to be reported. So it's reported at the 5-day as well as the discharge. Now, if by chance, because our patients are not widgets, our patients oftentimes are so medically complex that you could have done everything right and planned it out, and we're not going to exceed your 25%. And this patient's been getting the best outcomes under, some group and concurrent. And then they unexpectedly go out to the acute care hospital. So they discharge. They don't come back in their interrupted stay window. And perhaps that patient had 30%. And so what CMS is saying at that is the documentation needs to support that. So the documentation would support that we had them planned out, that they wouldn't exceed that 25%, but that the patient went out to the hospital unexpectedly. And in that situation, when the facility reports their therapy minutes and the group and concurrent minutes, they'll get what is called a non-fatal warning. So I know that sounds very scary, but they're getting a non-fatal warning that's going to say, hey, you exceeded it. Basically, we're expecting the documentation to support that. Now, when we look at, so that's an important piece when you ask when you ask the question about how do we have a voice, or how do we go about this, because you have to understand the regulatory piece behind that. Yeah. And then really what we should be doing, and again, my broken record, it comes back to your eval, right? So when we're doing our evaluation, it is our responsibility as licensed therapists, when we're doing that comprehensive evaluation, to take into consideration, what are my goals that I want this patient to achieve? What are the patient's goals? And then what is the best mode of therapy to achieve those goals? So when you're looking at that, you're looking at, okay, how can we get the best outcome for this patient? It may not always be that it's individual. We might think at the beginning, this patient is so medically complex that I don't think they'll be able to participate in a group or a concurrent session. And that's okay. But maybe as the patient is progressing with therapy, you're noticing that this patient is really struggling maybe to participate with some therapeutic activity. And you have another patient who has similar interest. And so maybe they're appropriate for concurrent. And it's really about thinking about the full picture, right? This isn't a decision that should be made based upon what my schedule is, right? So it shouldn't be made based upon the fact of saying, I have to get 8 hours a day. I completely understand that. But it's not about really what we want. as a clinician. So meaning that it's not about saying, how can I get my 8 hours? Because it's about the patient. And so when you're talking about patient-driven payment model, it puts that focus back on the patient. So it's our responsibility really to look at how can we get the patient to achieve their goals? And so it might be through some use of group. It might be through some use of concurrent. And so it comes back to, how are we doing with this patient, and how is the patient achieving their goals? Because ultimately, PDPM is about how can we get the best client outcomes. And so there's a lot of benefits that come with group and concurrent. And I know there's a lot of questions kind of around that. And I think what's important to also note is, your group therapy sessions should be planned out. It shouldn't be something where, you go into work today and it says, oh, well, today's a group. There needs to be pre-planning. That's part of what goes along with group therapy is it's a planned activity. So we want to look at this and kind of think about everything that our patients do in their day-to-day life. Think about what we do in our day-to-day life. I personally, I go to a Pilates class. Right? There's other people in my Pilates class. We have a lot of our patients participate. They go to bingo in groups. They go to church in groups. There's a lot of social benefits that come along with participating in a group. And we see great outcomes and patient engagement in groups. But there also has to be pre-planning with that. So really what we should be doing is we should be kind of taking a step back, looking at what are the patients that we're treating right now. So if you've got a high amount of patients, maybe that discharge home, maybe we need to do a discharge planning group every Tuesday at 2:00. And maybe that's something that Sabrina runs for her OT group. And then we plan it out the week before and we say, hey, these 4 patients would benefit from this group. So there needs to be really that evaluation in the clinical decision of really who is appropriate and for what, and also understanding that, it's that max of 25%. So the goal is that we're getting benefit from that group or that concurrent, and then we're being able to progress the patient with the individual component as well.
Okay. No, that's good. Being able to just kind of clarify, because there's so many questions around that, isn't there? Just floating around. Hey, what happens if there is a facility that is like chronically over that 25%? And you have your slap on the wrist essentially. And then, what happens if it's just kind of a ongoing issue?
So here's what I'm going to say is that CMS, John Kane, who's been really the voice of PDPM, has been very outspoken saying that CMS is going to be monitoring. They're going to be monitoring trends. So they're going to be monitoring the group and concurrent via the claim submissions. So your MDSs. So they're going to be monitoring for, what is the difference in the utilization of therapy minutes? And what is your utilization for that? They're going to be looking at outcomes related to the patients. What CMS has said is that they're putting together a robust monitoring system. I can't explain to you what the robust part is. That's to be determined. I think that it's important to note that we're only 17 days in. So we're 17. Yeah,
I know. It's been going on for, you've been talking about this for how long? And we're 17 days in.
It's hard to believe it's only been 17 days, but we're 17 days in. And so this is still, we're all trying to figure this out together. And so we're trying to figure out what does our role look like under PDPM, and how does all this play in? And so I think, though, just to reassure all of us as practitioners that are working in skilled nursing, that CMS is going to be monitoring. And so they'll be monitoring concurrent and group. They're monitoring the intensity of therapy services. But They're also monitoring other items like the mechanical soft diet and upcoding of ICD-10 codes and inappropriate early discharge. So are we discharging everybody at, day 20 because starting at day 21, we start to reduce the PT and OT component by 2% every 7 days. And also that overuse of an interrupted stay policy. So they've been very outspoken that those are the 6 items that they're going to be closely monitoring for every skilled nursing facility.
Okay. And those are the things that are good to know. I mean, so, okay, let's say you're working in a facility where you don't feel like they are letting you make those clinical decisions on group or one-on-one. Let's say we've done a really good evaluation and we really feel like it just isn't necessarily appropriate. Do you have any suggestions on how that could be approached with your director to kind of make, because you have to be a steward of the business. It's a business. We like it or not. Healthcare is a business. And, but also like being, advocating for our clients and then, us as clinicians.
Yeah. And I think that at the core of this is all of us understanding the different rules and regulations and having that accountability and the acceptance that the rules and regulations have changed. And therapy is not the driver of reimbursement anymore. And we now are a cost. So with that could come, where we're going to have to really explain the why behind us wanting to do something where maybe we didn't have to explain that before. So with that, not every single patient will be appropriate for group or concurrent. I mean, as occupational therapy practitioners, there's great groups that we can do, but there's also, if we do a lot of showering, you can't do a showering group, right? So I think we need, it would be crazy. So we need to understand, I think, first and foremost, and accept that there are changes to the reimbursement. And we're at day 17, and these changes, this is our new norm. And so if we have to be very open-minded and understanding about that. And I know that change is hard. And sometimes it's very easy just to kind of do that automatic resistance to it. But we have to understand that this is about the patient. So if you're in a situation where, say, I go into the facility and I'm given, my schedule and there's 4 patients who are on there that are a group. And these are 4 patients that, maybe are bedbound and I'm doing contracture management with that. I have to know my patients to feel confident enough from a clinical standpoint to say, can we please talk about my schedule? Because this is what I'm doing with these patients. These are my goals, and this is what my treatment intervention was going to be today. So we've got to make sure that we understand too, the why, instead of, approaching and saying, I won't do any groups or I won't do any concurrent. Is that really the best way to approach it? Or is it also that approaching it with understanding of saying, okay, these patients you assigned me for a group, but these patients aren't appropriate, and the why behind it, because I'm working on X, Y, and Z with them. So I think it's about your having that comprehensive evaluation, really planning out and knowing what is it that you're going to be working on with the patients and how are you best going to be able to achieve those goals for the patient, really to have that conversation and say, this is why this patient wouldn't be beneficial today for group, or even the other way of saying, I really would like to place these patients in a group today because of X, Y, and Z. Because you have to justify in your documentation for group therapy why you did group therapy. So you have to pre-plan it and you have to have that justification. So I think it's about bringing it back to the clinical piece as to what are your goals and ultimately being able to show our distinct value. So we have to be able to articulate within our documentation. And I know none of us went to school to be journalists, but we've all become journalists. And if we like it or not, right? Our documentation is so imperative because our documentation is what's going to support what the patient needs clinically.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. And I think just like you were saying, I think it's important to kind of note about how the transition from volume to value is really key. And it's really, I think, super challenging. So when I graduated, PPS was just kind of coming in, and actually people lost a lot of jobs at that initial time. Ooh, hi. Sorry. Sorry, it was crazy crackle. A lot of people lost some jobs, I think, because sometimes people kind of, in companies, a little freak out. They don't know all the regulations and they're trying to figure it out. And because of that transition from volume to value, the minutes, the high volume of people seeing patients for 75 minutes each time so they can get in an ultra high rug. The idea is that is no longer an issue. So, but subsequently, some PRN jobs have been cut and some other positions have been cut. People really worry about job loss. And there's been people that have had job loss because of the transition of the new payment system. Could you maybe explain why that potentially could have, why that would have been?
Well,
explain kind of how that system, how the change in system can cause that?
Well, I think there's a lot of variables as to why exactly there were job losses on October 1st, the day of the transition. And I can't speak specifically to each one of those situations as to the why certain companies made certain choices. But I think that it's important to note for a couple of things. The first, there were definitely some changes in regards to some people. Their skilled nursing facility had what we call contract therapy services. So they worked for a contract rehab company. So the rehab was outsourced and the facility made a decision to go in-house. So that can be a variable that comes along with it. Another variable that comes along with it is we've had a shift that's taking place in some of our facilities where their Medicare Part A census has drastically shifted. So it could be a situation where there was a high volume, a high census of Medicare Part A patients, and now they're not seeing that many patients. So maybe they've had a drop in census, so the census itself cannot support the staffing. I think it's important, though, not to do a blanket statement and say, layoffs were the result of X, Y, and Z, because there are variables with it. But I think it is important to note that, sometimes there are, unfortunately, job losses associated with the volume changes. So shifts in the census, some facilities sometimes become bedlocked. So you might have had a lot of Medicare Part A patients that have transitioned to long-term care. So you don't have, enough open beds to accept maybe the volume of your Medicare Part A patients that are out there. So I know there's variables that come with that, and looking at what truly are the staffing needs to really meet all the clinical needs of the patients based upon the census that's in that building.
Is there any difference in reimbursement for the facility if it is an OTR treating a client versus an OT assistant?
That's a really good question. There is no difference in the reimbursement for the facility. The way that it's looked at is occupational therapy practitioner. It can be an R, can be a licensed therapist, can be an assistant. Obviously, we need to follow all the rules and guidelines for supervision and all of that.
Right.
But in terms of the reimbursement component, there is no difference from a facility standpoint for our current Medicare Part A PDPM. And I know there's been some kind of confusion around that. I'm glad we are able to clarify that piece of it.
Yeah, definitely. Because those are the things that people always kind of worry about. People are going into therapy and then you have a transition of, reimbursement services. And then also you have social media as its own beast, right? And so there gets to be a lot of rumors, good and bad, pros and cons, right? And it just kind of like exemplifies. So I really do feel like it's super important. And that's one of the reasons why I'm so glad you're here, is because I really wanted to just like kind of get the facts down and seeing like what is going on. And there are going to be, with any kind of transition of payment, unfortunately, there's going to be job changes, like, people let go, or restructuring of the company, or new jobs for X, Y, and Z. So I think it's just so important. And I think what I'm really hoping is empowering to people to have kind of a good basic understanding. I know a lot of companies are really trying hard and, educating their staff on PDPM because it's important. But I think it's just so much, talk out there. So these kinds of conversations are so important.
And one of the things too that I really see as a positive under PDPM for occupational therapy practitioners is I oftentimes like to ask, when I go into facilities or I talk to occupational therapy practitioners, I like to ask, does your facility really understand what occupational therapy is? I mean,
that's a good question.
We've tried really hard as a profession, and I think we've come a long way. And we were in the Rose Parade, but
I know.
It's one of those things where what we've kind of established is this day-to-day routine in facilities where they kind of see, and it's not unique just to OT. I think the same barriers and challenges exist for PT and speech, where they kind of just think of us as doing a certain thing. And so this is an opportunity for us really to partner with the facility, really say, can I get in front of they call them all staff, they do them once a month. Can we get in front of them and can we explain to them what occupational therapy is and really look at what is it that the facility, where are kind of their focuses from their quality measure standpoint? So it might be something where we can really partner with the facility in really addressing urinary incontinence. So it may not be something that the facility necessarily has looked at occupational therapy to really help them with urinary incontinence. But my goal before I retire is that we do not put every patient inside of a wheelchair when they wheel in and put a brief on them. So I see this as our opportunity to really stand up and to be the advocate for the patients, to really show our distinct value beyond just a toileting program. Because when you're looking at PDPM, there's nothing that says, and I think that this is a great positive, nothing is stopping us from, when that patient gets admitted, going with the admission nurse and completing our evaluation with the admission nurse. So that way we can really start right when they wheel in the door by asking the questions, what was your toileting routine at home? Tell me what your toileting routine was in the hospital. And if we have somebody who's continent, well, then we need to, call the family and we need to get them to bring in their undergarments. So that way we're not putting a brief on them. And right from the beginning, be the advocate and be the voice of that patient and really start highlighting our outcomes, because I also think we don't do a good job of that really as an industry by saying, look at the great therapy that I provided to Mrs. Smith. When she came in, she was dependent with all of her ADLs, and together with physical therapy, she walked out the door and she was completely independent. So we've got to really kind of start thinking about our role and our education and our partnership with the facility different too, because we're no longer what is driving the reimbursement. So there are going to be questions, and it's understandable that there's going to be questions as to, well, what is it that occupational therapy can provide? What is it that physical therapy can provide? What is it that speech can provide? Because we've just kind of been in this routine, good, bad, or indifferent. And now is our opportunity really to kind of shake things up, so to speak, with the facility and really partner with them and help with their outcomes and be a patient advocate, maybe in a different way than what we were under PPS.
Well, it goes back to doing some of those really good evaluations and having the correct documentation and the coding and all that stuff that we don't necessarily like to do, but it's imperative, especially when you're changing from a volume to value type of reimbursement system. So kind of just, we've already been talking 45 minutes, Sabrina.
Hey, PDPM is fun.
So, let's say we have concerns, about our facility, and we've talked to our rehab director and we just don't feel like we're getting through. We want to advocate. Is there, a system? Who can we turn to? Do we go to AOTA? Do we go to higher ups in the company? Do we talk to, who would be our best resource?
So that's a really great question. I want to start with the AOTA piece because I know that some people have expressed frustration and anger about not even knowing about PDPM. And I go back to what I said at the beginning, that I think it's all of our responsibility to know about the rules and regulations in the settings that we're working. And AOTA has done a great job of really preparing its members for PDPM. They had the one-day symposium. There's been articles in OT practice. There's been webinars. They've got their quality tab on their website. So membership within the professional organization, I think, is so valuable. And in a time, especially working in healthcare, because they really are, they've got their finger on the pulse. They know what's going on. They're helping to educate us. And they are, they're there for us. So we always can go to AOTA with concerns, with complaints, with success stories. We don't always have to go to them with bad things. They might like good things.
Right.
I'm just saying they might. And so they're a good avenue. But also, if you're feeling like your rehab director is kind of conveying a message that is not in line with your company's mission and vision and values, there should be an open door policy. So there should be the opportunity where you can go to their supervisor or even the supervisor above them. And so there should be, an open door policy where you've got everybody's, names and titles and phone numbers listed. Also, there should be a compliance hotline. If you're very concerned and you want to be anonymous, I would encourage that as well. So there are avenues to have your voices be heard.
Okay. Is there a way to notify or talk to or email like CMS about some of your concerns?
I'm not quite honestly, I'm not sure how you, CMS has, they have, I'm spacing on what it's called, but they do have email addresses where you can contact them. So you can contact them. They have SNF open door forum calls that are open to anybody, to the public, that they publish. They announce those in advance. So anybody can sign up for the CMS emails. They tend to email a lot, just in fair warning. So you'll get quite a few emails. But you definitely can arm yourself, so to speak, with getting more information by signing up for their newsletters, and their emails, and attending things like their open door forum. When the proposed rule came out for PDPM, every time that there's a proposed regulatory change, they publish it. They've got to legally publish it. And then they open it up to public comment. So
there was one recently that was talking about, now I'm on the spot and I'm just like, I like how I bring it up and then I don't even remember what it's about. But it was that type of thing where they literally are open for comment, and you can actually read what other people comment on regarding a proposed change. And I shared that just so if people were interested, then they know exactly where to go. But being on the email list would be good.
And always when it's open for comment too, if it might be a little intimidating to, put a comment letter together for CMS where you're saying, I don't agree with maybe in the proposed time frame, if you were writing a comment, maybe you didn't agree with the change of the definition of group, but you didn't really know how to formulate that into a letter that would make sense. That's where, again, AOTA comes in very handy, reaching out to them. Every time there's a regulatory change piece, it's always open to public comment, and any public member can submit it. So any of us can submit it. And then if you're looking for some really great reads, a couple thousand pages sometimes, once they publish it, they publish, the comments and the summary. And so there's a lot of information in there. And I know that not everybody is like me. So meaning that they don't really find joy in reading like the Federal Register or the final rule. I wish I could say you print it off and you put it underneath your pillow at night and it will just sink in, but that doesn't happen. So there's other avenues where, again, I know AOTA sends out, the summaries of it. So really following it, and you mentioned social media. So, you can even follow CMS on Twitter. You can follow APTA and AOTA and other organizations on Twitter, where really what their main goal is to get the information out there so that we're educated.
That's good to know, because you kind of don't sometimes feel like using social, or you don't realize the power of social media. You don't realize the ways that you can get information like that. Do you know what I mean? Like hardcore, down and dirty info out there. Okay. So like I was saying earlier, I know a lot of companies are really kind of trying to work on PDPM trainings internally. I know AOTA has a number of webinars and information for PDPM. Is there any other resources that you think would be helpful for people if they are really looking for more? I'm going to add in that CMS link. Information.
I always feel, and I hope that everybody who listens to this feels the same way, that having that source document is so important. Like, I like to see things in writing, right? If someone says, CMS said, well, can I see that CMS said that, right? And so what CMS did, I'm so happy that CMS put so much work in it, and it's great. This website that they have been updating FAQs. And so you can go onto that website, and they've got, I believe it's just they've got a 42-page FAQ that puts all of this information together. And then they've just got links specifically to items such as group and concurrent. And so you can click on that and you can read, everything about group and concurrent, the rules and regulations. So I think that them as the source of the creator of this, they're definitely the best resource in addition to everything that AOTA has.
Yeah, perfect. And I'll put those links in the show notes as well. Thank you, Sabrina, for all your wealth of knowledge and sharing with us and debunking the myths and having some questions answered. And, having us learn about PDPM and what that means for our clients, what that means for us. So I appreciate you being here today. Thank you for having me. Thanks, everyone, for listening. So until next time.
Do you feel like you're navigating the OT world without a map? Not feeling confident or competent in your day-to-day treatments and struggling to apply your knowledge clinically? Then be sure to check out the Seniors Flourish Learning Lab membership. It has all of the treatment ideas, patient handouts, clinical resources, community support, and mentorship you need to succeed. Join today at seniorsflourish.com/learninglab.